What if I told you that America's founding story has more secrets buried in it than a Philadelphia basement? That the men who wrote about liberty and equality were living lives so complicated, so contradictory, that most textbooks simply skip the messy parts? You probably think you know the founding fathers. Powdered wigs, some cherry tree nonsense, a few famous quotes about freedom. But here's the thing, the real story is stranger, darker, and honestly more human than anything they taught you in school. Tonight we're going somewhere different, not conspiracy theories, not internet rumors, but the documented, researched, sometimes debated history that rarely makes it into the classroom. Secret societies, hidden affairs, political betrayals so vicious they make modern Twitter fights look tame. Duels fought over honor, fortunes built on uncomfortable foundations, alliances formed in candlelit rooms where the fate of a nation was quietly negotiated. Now, I want to be upfront with you. History is messy. Some of what you're about to hear is well-documented fact. Some of it is historical debate, where scholars still argue about what really happened. I'll be honest with you about which is which as we go, because these men weren't gods carved into a mountain. They were people. Brilliant, flawed, complicated people trying to build something that had never quite existed before. So before we drift into the past together, do me a favor. If you enjoy history that actually feels alive, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it costs you nothing but a click. Now settle in, dim the lights, let your body relax, and let your mind wander back to candlelit rooms, secret letters, and the very human men behind America's founding myths. 99 secrets await you. Let's begin with number 1. It's 1787 in Philadelphia, and the windows of Independence Hall are nailed shut, curtains drawn, guards posted at every door. What were they so desperate to hide from the public during the very convention that created American democracy? One of those hidden truths starts with something as simple as George Washington's smile, or rather, the careful way he avoided smiling at all. For centuries, school children were taught that Washington's famous false teeth were carved from wood. They weren't. His dentures were actually crafted from a combination of materials, including ivory, gold wire fittings, and human teeth. The wooden teeth story likely spread because ivory stains and cracks over time, giving it a grainy, wood-like appearance. Washington suffered from dental problems his entire adult life, losing teeth steadily from his 20s onward. By the time he became president, he had only one natural tooth remaining. The ill-fitting dentures were often uncomfortable, which some historians believe explains his famously tight-lipped expression in portraits. And speaking of those dentures, there's a more uncomfortable detail buried in Washington's own financial records. Ledgers from Mount Vernon show payments made for teeth, 9 of them purchased from enslaved individuals living on the plantation. Historians still debate the full context here. Some argue this reflects a common practice of the era, where people sold teeth for transplantation or denture construction, often out of financial desperation. Others point out the deeply troubling power imbalance involved when the seller is enslaved and has little real choice in the transaction. What's certain is that the record exists in Washington's own handwriting, a small transaction that connects the nation's first president directly to the institution of slavery in an unexpectedly personal way. Long before he sat for portraits or worried about his teeth, Washington was running something far more secretive, an actual spy network. During the Revolutionary War, he personally directed what became known as the Culper Ring, a group of civilian operatives gathering intelligence around British-occupied New York City. The spies used invisible ink, coded numbers instead of names, and elaborate signals involving laundry hung out to dry. Washington himself reviewed reports and helped shape strategy based on this intelligence. The ring's existence remained largely unknown to the public for over a century after the war, its members' identities protected even from most of Washington's own officers. Washington's talent for careful messaging didn't end with the war. Consider his famous farewell address, the speech every American thinks they've heard delivered dramatically before Congress. In reality, Washington never spoke it aloud at all. Instead, it was published as a letter in a Philadelphia newspaper called the American Daily Advertiser in 1796. Washington worked on the address for years, drafting sections with help from Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. The written format allowed for careful, deliberate language warning against political parties and foreign entanglements, concerns that still get quoted today, even though most people picture a speech that technically never happened. Despite guiding a revolution and shaping a presidency, Washington's personal letters reveal a man who genuinely longed to simply go home. Throughout his public life, he repeatedly expressed his desire to retire permanently to Mount Vernon and manage his farms. After the war ended, he did retire briefly, believing his public service was finished. Circumstances kept pulling him back, first to preside over the Constitutional Convention, then to accept the presidency he never actively campaigned for. Letters to friends showed genuine reluctance, a man weighing duty against personal desire, again and again choosing the nation over the quiet life he claimed to prefer. That sense of duty showed up again during the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when Washington did something no sitting American president has done since. Farmers in western Pennsylvania, angry over a federal tax on whiskey, rose up in armed protest. Washington personally donned his old military uniform and rode at the head of a militia force marching toward the rebellion. He didn't lead troops into the final confrontation itself, handing command over before reaching the rebellion's center, but his willingness to personally mobilize an army against fellow citizens sent an unmistakable message about federal authority, one that still sparks debate among historians about the balance between government power and civil dissent. And speaking of Washington's complicated relationship with power and money, there's his presidential salary to consider. When Washington took office in 1789, he actually tried to decline his salary entirely, offering to serve without pay, much like he'd done as commander of the Continental Army. Congress said no. Lawmakers worried that an unpaid presidency would set a dangerous precedent, essentially creating a job only wealthy men could ever afford to hold. They insisted Washington accept the $25,000 annual salary, a substantial sum at the time. Washington reluctantly agreed, though he reportedly grumbled about it in private correspondence. Some historians view this as evidence of Washington's genuine humility and his wariness about turning the presidency into anything resembling royalty. Others note that Washington was already one of the wealthiest men in America, so declining a salary would have cost him relatively little while making a powerful symbolic statement. Either way, Congress's insistence established an important precedent of its own, that the presidency would be a paid public office accessible in theory to men of more modest means, not an unpaid position reserved exclusively for aristocrats. It's a small footnote in Washington's story, but one that shaped how Americans would think about the presidency as a job rather than a title. And speaking of things Washington never quite had, formal education ranks pretty high on that list. Unlike many of the founding fathers who attended prestigious universities, Washington's schooling ended somewhere around age 11 or 12. His father died when Washington was young, and the family's financial situation meant that college, unlike his older half-brothers, simply wasn't in the cards. Instead, Washington largely educated himself. He studied surveying, a practical trade that took him into the Virginia wilderness and taught him mathematics, geography, and self-reliance. He read voraciously throughout his life, military manuals, agricultural guides, etiquette books, anything that might make him appear more polished and capable. Some historians suggest Washington felt a lifelong insecurity about his lack of formal education, especially when surrounded by men like Jefferson and Madison who had received extensive university training. This may explain his notoriously careful, reserved speaking style. He rarely spoke off the cuff in public settings, preferring prepared remarks where every word could be considered in advance. Whatever insecurity he carried, it clearly didn't hold him back. Washington became one of the most respected military and political figures in American history, largely through experience, discipline, and self-study, rather than any formal degree. And speaking of setbacks Washington quietly overcame, his political career actually started with a loss, not a victory. In 1755, a young Washington ran for a seat in Virginia's House of Burgesses and lost the election. Some accounts suggest the defeat stemmed partly from Washington's inexperience with the retail politics of the era, which often involved buying rum and other spirits for voters, a common and expected practice at the time that Washington reportedly handled less generously than his opponents. He tried again a couple years later in 1758, this time embracing the tradition more fully, and won his seat representing Frederick County. Historians point to this episode as an early example of Washington's capacity for self-correction, recognizing what went wrong and adjusting his approach rather than abandoning politics altogether. It's a small, almost humanizing detail in the story of a man usually remembered as larger than life, a reminder that even Washington experienced ordinary political defeat before becoming the towering figure of American independence. The lesson apparently stuck with him. Throughout his later career, Washington remained keenly attentive to public perception and the practical realities of winning support, skills that would serve him well decades later, when far more than a local council seat was at stake. And speaking of Washington's lasting contributions beyond politics, here's one that still exists today in a different form. In 1782, Washington created the Badge of Military Merit, a purple, heart-shaped piece of cloth awarded to soldiers for extraordinary service and bravery. It was remarkably progressive for its time, one of the very few military honors available to enlisted soldiers rather than just officers. Only 3 soldiers are known to have received the original badge during the Revolutionary War. After that, the honor fell into obscurity for over a century, essentially forgotten until the 1930s. In 1932, on the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth, the U.S. Army revived the concept, creating the modern Purple Heart Medal awarded to service members wounded or killed in action. The design deliberately echoes Washington's original badge, featuring his profile at the center. So in a very real sense, one of America's most recognizable military honors traces its lineage directly back to an idea Washington championed nearly 250 years ago, honoring the sacrifice of ordinary soldiers, not just the generals who commanded them. And speaking of founding fathers with complicated legal legacies, let's turn to John Adams, who took on one of the most unpopular legal cases in colonial history. After British soldiers killed 5 colonists during the Boston Massacre in 1770, tensions ran so high that finding any lawyer willing to defend the soldiers seemed nearly impossible. Adams, already an established attorney and a growing voice in the patriot cause, agreed to represent them anyway. His reasoning centered on a principle he considered essential to justice itself, that every person, regardless of how unpopular, deserved a fair legal defense. The decision risked his reputation and his standing among fellow colonists furious over the killings. Adams argued the case skillfully, ultimately securing acquittals for 6 of the soldiers and reduced charges for 2 others. He later called it one of the best pieces of legal work he'd ever done, and one of the most important services he'd rendered his country. Some historians view this episode as a defining moment, showcasing Adams's commitment to law and principle over popular sentiment. Others note the case also served Adams's long-term political interests, demonstrating impartiality that later boosted his credibility. Regardless of motive, the case remains a remarkable example of legal courage during a moment of intense public anger. And speaking of Adams facing difficult moments alone, his departure from the presidency was about as quiet and lonely as these things get. After losing his 1800 re-election bid to Thomas Jefferson, a bitter and deeply personal political rivalry by that point, Adams made the unusual choice to leave Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day in 1801. He skipped Jefferson's inauguration entirely, becoming one of the few outgoing presidents in American history to do so. Historians offer various explanations. Some suggest raw political bitterness after a brutal mudslinging campaign. Others point to Adams still grieving the recent death of his son Charles, suggesting personal sorrow played as much a role as political resentment. Whatever the reason, Adams rode out of the Capitol largely alone, ending his presidency without ceremony or public farewell. It stood in sharp contrast to the peaceful transfer of power Americans now consider a hallmark of the presidency, a transfer that still happened, just without the pageantry we associate with it today. Adams spent his remaining years at his Massachusetts farm, eventually reconciling with Jefferson through a remarkable exchange of letters that lasted until both men died, fittingly on the same day. And speaking of that remarkable reconciliation between Adams and Jefferson, it's worth pausing on just how unlikely it was. These 2 men had once been close collaborators during the Revolution, then bitter political rivals during the brutal partisan wars of the 1790s, the kind of rivalry that involved newspaper attacks, accusations of tyranny, and years of complete silence between them. It took a mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, to finally nudge them back toward each other in 1812. Rush had long believed the two aging patriots owed it to history and to themselves to mend the friendship before it was too late. Adams wrote first, a short, almost cautious letter. Jefferson responded warmly, and from there the two exchanged over 150 letters across the next 14 years. They debated philosophy, religion, politics, and the meaning of the revolution they'd both helped create. Some historians consider this correspondence one of the most intellectually rich exchanges in American history. Two founding fathers reflecting honestly on power, mortality, and their shared legacy. Others note the letters conveniently smoothed over old political wounds, with both men presenting more polished versions of their earlier selves. Either way, the correspondence remains a remarkable historical record, proof that even the deepest political divisions can soften with time, distance, and a little help from a persistent mutual friend. And speaking of timing that seems almost too perfect to be real, both Adams and Jefferson died on the exact same day, July 4, 1826, precisely 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. The coincidence stunned the nation at the time, and has fascinated historians ever since. Adams died in Massachusetts in the afternoon, while Jefferson had passed away several hours earlier at Monticello in Virginia. Some Americans at the time viewed the timing as something close to providential, a sign that these two founders were somehow meant to depart together on the anniversary of the country they'd helped build. Others point out that both men were quite elderly and in declining health, so a death near the anniversary wasn't entirely implausible, just remarkably coincidental that it landed on the exact date rather than sometime nearby. Whatever the explanation, newspapers across the country seized on the symbolism immediately, framing it as a fitting, almost mythic conclusion to the founding generation story. It's the kind of detail that sounds invented, the sort of thing a novelist might reject as too convenient, yet it's thoroughly documented history. Two men who helped write and defend American independence, then spent years as rivals, then friends again, closing their lives on the very anniversary of the document that first made them famous. And speaking of Adams's final hours, his last words add an oddly poignant layer to that already strange coincidence. According to those present, Adams murmured, "Thomas Jefferson survives," shortly before he died. He had no way of knowing that Jefferson had actually passed away earlier that same day, hundreds of miles south in Virginia. Historians have long debated the exact wording Adams used, since accounts from witnesses vary slightly, but the sentiment remains consistent across the different versions. Some see this moment as a touching final gesture from Adams, his thoughts turning toward the man he'd feuded with, then reconciled with even as his own life ended. Others caution that we should be careful about reading too much poetic meaning into deathbed accounts, which were often polished or embellished after the fact to fit a satisfying narrative. Still true story or slightly romanticized retelling, it captures something real about the bond these two men had rebuilt in their final years. After decades of rivalry, reconciliation, and philosophical letter writing, Adams's mind apparently drifted toward his old friend and adversary in his very last moments, unaware that the two of them were, in fact, leaving the world together on the exact same extraordinary day. And speaking of founding fathers who leaned heavily on trusted advisors, John Adams relied on his wife Abigail far more than most people realize. Throughout his political career, Adams regularly wrote to Abigail seeking her opinion on policy decisions, potential appointments, and the shifting alliances among his political rivals. Their correspondence, over 1,100 letters survive today, reveals a partnership built on genuine intellectual respect, not just affection. Abigail managed the family farm and finances during Adams's long absences in Philadelphia and Europe, but she also offered sharp political analysis that Adams clearly valued. Some historians argue Abigail functioned as something close to an unofficial advisor, her insights shaping decisions Adams made as a diplomat and later as president. Others caution against overstating her formal influence, since she held no official role and Adams ultimately made his own choices. Still, the sheer volume and substance of their correspondence suggests she was far more than a passive sounding board. In an era when women were almost entirely excluded from formal political life, Abigail Adams carved out meaningful influence through personal correspondence and sheer intellectual force, becoming one of the most politically engaged women of the founding generation, even without holding any office herself. And speaking of Abigail's political voice, one letter stands out above all the others. In March of 1776, while John Adams and his fellow delegates debated independence in Philadelphia, Abigail wrote urging him to remember the ladies as lawmakers drafted new codes and laws for the emerging nation. She warned that men shouldn't hold unlimited power over women, and suggested that women wouldn't feel bound by laws in which they had no voice or representation. John's reply was famously dismissive, treating the request more as a joke than a serious political demand. Some historians view Abigail's letter as an early, remarkably forward-thinking call for women's legal rights, decades ahead of any organized movement. Others note it likely reflected personal frustration more than a formal policy proposal, since Abigail wasn't proposing suffrage or political office, just basic legal protections within marriage and property law. Regardless of her exact intent, the letter has become one of the most frequently cited documents in early American women's history, a rare surviving voice questioning gender inequality at the very moment the nation was declaring all men created equal, without yet extending that same declaration to women. And speaking of founders with unconventional approaches to religion, Thomas Jefferson literally took scissors to the Bible. Later in life, Jefferson compiled what's now known as the Jefferson Bible, cutting and pasting passages from the New Testament into a new arrangement of his own design. His goal was to isolate what he considered the authentic moral teachings of Jesus, while removing miracles, supernatural elements, and passages he viewed as later additions by others. Jefferson believed the result revealed Jesus primarily as a moral philosopher rather than a divine figure. He kept the project private during his lifetime, sharing it with only a small circle of friends, likely aware of how controversial it would seem given his public role. Some historians view this as clear evidence of Jefferson's deist leanings, a rational approach to faith consistent with Enlightenment thinking. Others caution against oversimplifying Jefferson's beliefs, noting his religious views were complex and evolved throughout his life. The book wasn't published until decades after his death, eventually printed by the U.S. government in the 20th century for a time. It remains one of the more curious artifacts of the founding era, a president literally reshaping scripture to fit his own personal philosophy. And speaking of Jefferson's complicated relationship with established authority, his own view of the Constitution wasn't always so settled either. When Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he privately worried that the Constitution never explicitly granted the federal government power to acquire new territory this way. He drafted amendments to formally authorize the purchase, believing the document should say so clearly, rather than leaving the matter to interpretation. His own cabinet convinced him the amendment process would take too long and risk losing the deal entirely. Some historians view this as evidence of Jefferson's genuine constitutional caution, a strict reading of federal limits even when it worked against his own interests. Others argue it shows a president willing to bend his principles when the political and territorial stakes were high enough. Jefferson ultimately proceeded without the amendment, doubling the size of the country through a purchase he privately believed might not be entirely constitutional. It's a quiet contradiction tucked into one of the most celebrated moments of his presidency, a man who spent his life warning against government overreach, personally authorizing one of the largest expansions of federal power in early American history, all while hoping nobody would ask too many questions about the legal justification behind it. And speaking of Jefferson keeping things quiet, the way Congress actually learned about the Louisiana Purchase involved more secrecy than most people realize. Jefferson's 1803 message to Congress regarding the negotiations was delivered confidentially, since the deal with France remained delicate and unfinished at the time. Diplomatic relations were fragile, Napoleon's intentions were unpredictable, and any premature leak could have unraveled the entire arrangement before it was finalized. Jefferson wanted lawmakers informed enough to prepare for ratification, but not so publicly that word might reach Paris or London before the ink was dry. Some historians see this as simply prudent diplomacy, standard practice for sensitive international negotiations still in progress. Others note it reflects Jefferson's broader comfort with executive secrecy when he judged the outcome important enough, despite his public reputation as a defender of transparency and limited government. The confidential approach worked. Congress ratified the purchase without complications, and the deal closed before opposition could organize against it. It's a small procedural detail easily lost beneath the excitement of doubling the nation's size, yet it reveals something quietly telling about how even the most idealistic founders occasionally decided that some information was better shared, carefully, selectively, and only with those who absolutely needed to know it first. And speaking of Jefferson's fascination with the unexplored territory he'd just acquired, his curiosity extended well beyond politics and into paleontology. Jefferson studied fossils extensively, and he genuinely hoped that mammoths, or something like them, might still be roaming the vast unmapped regions of the American West. He'd examined mammoth bones discovered in places like Kentucky and found the idea of extinction philosophically troubling, since it seemed to contradict his understanding of a naturally balanced, divinely ordered world. When he sent Lewis and Clark on their famous expedition, he reportedly instructed them to keep an eye out for any living giant creatures they might encounter along the way. Some historians frame this as a charming example of Enlightenment-era curiosity, a founding father blending scientific inquiry with genuine wonder about the unknown wilderness beyond the Mississippi. Others point out it reflects the limits of scientific understanding at the time, when the very concept of extinction was still hotly debated among naturalists. Either way, Lewis and Clark never did find any mammoths lumbering through the Rockies. Jefferson's fascination remained just that, a fascination, though it says something endearing about the man that amid diplomacy, war, and constitutional worries, he still found time to wonder if prehistoric giants might be waiting quietly in the unexplored corners of his new territory. And speaking of Jefferson's fondness for the natural world, his personal life included at least one small unexpected companion. Jefferson kept a pet mockingbird, and according to several accounts, he allowed it remarkable freedom throughout his time in the president's house. The bird reportedly perched on his shoulder while he worked, followed him around rooms, and was even said to take food gently from his lips. Jefferson apparently adored the bird's singing and found its company soothing during the long hours of paperwork and correspondence that filled his days. Some historians treat this as a delightful, well-documented glimpse into Jefferson's private personality, a formal, reserved public figure who nonetheless enjoyed genuine tenderness toward animals. Others caution that many details come from secondhand recollections written well after the fact, the kind of charming anecdote that tends to grow more elaborate with each retelling. Still, the core detail appears consistently enough across sources to suggest it's rooted in real behavior rather than pure invention. It's a small, gentle image to hold on to, a president known for sweeping political philosophy and complicated historical legacies, quietly working through official correspondence with a small songbird perched contentedly on his shoulder, singing away in the background of early American history. And speaking of sides of Jefferson that don't always match his polished public image, his personal finances tell a surprisingly troubled story. Despite inheriting substantial land, enslaved workers, and social standing, Jefferson died deeply in debt, owing an amount that would translate to millions in today's currency. Years of expensive renovations at Monticello, lavish entertaining, generous spending on books and wine, and struggling agricultural profits combined to erode his finances steadily over time. Some historians view this as a cautionary tale about the gap between Jefferson's public philosophy of self-sufficiency and his private financial habits, which leaned heavily on credit and optimism rather than restraint. Others note that many wealthy planters of his era faced similar struggles, caught in an agricultural economy that made steady profit difficult even for the most established families. Either way, the debt had real consequences. After Jefferson's death, his family was forced to sell Monticello along with most of its contents, and the people he'd enslaved were sold as well to help settle what he owed. It's a sobering footnote to a legacy often remembered for eloquent ideals about liberty and independence. A reminder that Jefferson's personal financial independence never quite matched the principles he spent his life so famously writing about. And speaking of how Jefferson wanted to be remembered, he left remarkably specific instructions about his own epitaph. Rather than listing his presidency, arguably the most powerful office in the young nation, Jefferson chose to highlight 3 achievements he considered more meaningful: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. He deliberately omitted his time as president, along with numerous other titles he'd held throughout his long public career. Some historians interpret this as a genuine reflection of Jefferson's personal priorities, valuing ideas and institutions over political power itself. Others suggest it was a carefully curated final act of self-presentation, shaping his legacy one last time exactly as he wanted history to remember it. Either explanation fits a man who spent much of his life thinking carefully about symbolism, language, and how future generations might interpret his choices. His modest gravestone at Monticello still bears exactly what he requested. No mention of the presidency at all. It's a fitting final note on Jefferson's complicated, contradictory life. A founding father who helped build the nation's highest office, then chose, in the end, not to mention it at all. 25. And speaking of Jefferson's carefully managed legacy, one aspect of his personal life has generated debate for generations. Historical evidence, including DNA testing conducted in the late 1990s, strongly suggests that Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved at Monticello. The DNA study found a genetic link between the Hemings descendants and the Jefferson male line, though it couldn't definitively prove Thomas Jefferson himself was the father rather than another Jefferson relative. Combined with detailed accounts from Hemings' family oral history and the timing of her pregnancies coinciding with Jefferson's presence at Monticello, most historians now consider the relationship highly probable. Some scholars remain cautious, noting the limits of DNA evidence and the impossibility of fully understanding consent within a system where Hemings had no legal power to refuse. Others argue the historical record, taken together, leaves little reasonable doubt. What's rarely disputed is the deeply troubling power imbalance at the center of it all, a relationship that could never have existed on equal footing, given the realities of slavery. It's a complicated, uncomfortable chapter that historians continue studying carefully, a reminder that even the author of soaring words about liberty lived a private life that directly contradicted them. 26. And speaking of founding fathers with complicated personal histories, let's shift to one who built his entire fortune from something far less controversial: ink and paper. Benjamin Franklin made his money primarily through printing, publishing, and a network of savvy business ventures across the colonies. He started as an apprentice in his brother's print shop before eventually running his own successful business in Philadelphia, printing newspapers, pamphlets, and official government documents. Franklin was remarkably entrepreneurial for his time, setting up print shop partnerships in other cities and earning a share of the profits without having to manage the daily operations himself. This early franchise-style approach let him build wealth efficiently, while expanding his influence throughout the colonies. By his early 40s, Franklin had earned enough to retire from active business and devote himself to science, invention, and public service. His printing background shaped much of his later life, giving him both financial independence and a deep understanding of how information spread. It's easy to picture Franklin purely as a statesman or scientist, but his fortune, and the freedom it gave him to pursue everything else he's remembered for, came from ink-stained hands and a genuine talent for the printing business. 27. And speaking of Franklin's later years, by the time the Constitutional Convention convened in 1787, his health told a very different story than his younger, more energetic days. At 81 years old, Franklin was the oldest delegate present, and his frail physical condition made it difficult for him to stand and speak for extended periods. Because of this, Franklin often had his written remarks read aloud by fellow delegate James Wilson, rather than delivering speeches himself. This arrangement allowed Franklin's ideas and diplomatic influence to remain part of the debates without requiring the physical stamina public speaking demanded. Some historians see this as a quiet testament to Franklin's determination, still contributing meaningfully to the nation's founding despite significant physical limitations. Others note it highlights just how much the convention relied on collaborative effort, with delegates supporting one another through whatever means necessary to keep the process moving forward. Franklin's declining health didn't diminish his symbolic importance, however. His presence alone lent enormous credibility to the proceedings. It's a gentler side of the convention's story, an elder statesman, too frail for lengthy speeches, still finding ways to make his voice heard through the mouths of younger colleagues gathered around him. 28. And speaking of Franklin finding creative ways to make his voice heard, long before the convention, he'd already mastered the art of writing under someone else's name entirely. As a teenager working at his brother's print shop, Franklin secretly submitted essays under the pseudonym Silence Dogood, pretending to be a middle-aged widow with sharp opinions about colonial society. His brother published the letters without knowing their true author, and they became surprisingly popular before Franklin's identity was eventually revealed. Decades later, he adopted another pseudonym, Richard Saunders, to publish his famous almanac. Writing under invented personas gave Franklin creative freedom he might not have had otherwise, allowing him to experiment with humor, satire, and social commentary without his real name attached. Some historians view this as evidence of Franklin's playful, mischievous personality, someone who genuinely enjoyed the game of concealed identity. Others point out it was also a practical strategy, letting a young or ambitious writer test ideas safely before attaching his reputation to them. Either way, Franklin's willingness to hide behind clever disguises reveals a writer who understood the power of voice and perspective long before he became one of the most recognizable names in American history. 29. And speaking of Richard Saunders, that particular pseudonym became attached to one of Franklin's most enduring achievements. Franklin published Poor Richard's Almanac every year for 25 consecutive years, filling its pages with weather predictions, practical advice, and the pithy sayings that remain famous today. Lines like "early to bed and early to rise," and "a penny saved is a penny earned" originated, or were at least popularized within its pages. The almanac became one of the best-selling publications in the colonies, second only to the Bible in some regions, and it significantly boosted Franklin's reputation and income. Behind the folksy wisdom was a shrewd businessman, using humor and relatability to build a loyal readership year after year. Some historians note that many of Franklin's famous sayings weren't entirely original, borrowed and reworked from older proverbs, but his gift was packaging them memorably. Others emphasize that this borrowing was common practice at the time and doesn't diminish Franklin's cleverness in curating such a lasting collection. 25 years is a remarkably long run for any publication, and it cemented Franklin's image as both an entertaining writer and a trusted voice of practical, everyday wisdom. 30. And speaking of Franklin's clever, practical mind, some of his earliest innovations had nothing to do with writing at all. As a young man passionate about swimming, Franklin designed a pair of wooden hand paddles, oval-shaped boards attached to his hands, meant to help him move through the water more efficiently. He also experimented with similar attachments for his feet, though he found those less effective and eventually abandoned the idea. Franklin later wrote about these early swimming aids in letters, describing his enthusiasm for the sport and his instinct to tinker with ways to improve human performance in the water. Some historians consider this an early sign of the inventive curiosity that would define his entire life, a mind constantly looking for practical improvements to everyday activities. Others simply enjoy it as a charming glimpse into Franklin's youth, long before diplomacy, science, and politics consumed his time. His enthusiasm for swimming stayed with him throughout his life, and he's sometimes cited as an early advocate for swimming as both exercise and recreation. It's a lighthearted footnote to a legacy filled with monumental achievements, a reminder that even future founding fathers once spent their afternoons happily splashing around, inventing gadgets for fun. 31. And speaking of Franklin's lifelong tinkering with everyday problems, one of his most practical inventions came from simple frustration with his own aging eyes. As Franklin grew older, he found himself needing two different pairs of glasses, one for distance and one for reading, and switching between them constantly annoyed him. So he came up with a clever solution. He took the lenses from both pairs, cut them in half, and combined them into a single frame, creating what we now call bifocals. The top half handled distance vision, while the bottom half was ground for reading, letting him glance down at a book or up at a landscape without swapping glasses every few minutes. Franklin described this invention in letters to friends, clearly pleased with how well it solved his personal problem. Some historians note that Franklin wasn't necessarily the very first person to think of split lenses, but he's widely credited as the one who popularized and refined the concept into practical everyday use. It's a wonderfully Franklin kind of invention, born not from grand scientific ambition, but from mild irritation and a desire for convenience. Centuries later, millions of people still rely on bifocals every single day. A quiet legacy from a man who apparently hated fumbling with two pairs of glasses just as much as anyone alive today. 32. And speaking of Franklin's inventive streak, let's revisit probably the most famous story associated with his name, one that's often repeated with more drama than the evidence actually supports. The popular legend has Franklin flying a kite during a thunderstorm in 1752, with lightning striking the kite directly and traveling down the string to a key, nearly electrocuting him in the process. It makes for a thrilling image, but most historians who've studied Franklin's own writings believe the experiment was considerably less dramatic and considerably less dangerous than legend suggests. Franklin was likely testing whether storm clouds carried electrical charge by flying the kite during a storm and observing whether the string became electrified from ambient charge in the air, not from a direct lightning strike, which would have almost certainly killed him instantly. Some researchers even question whether Franklin performed the experiment himself at all, or simply described a method others may have carried out first. What's fairly well agreed upon is that Franklin's work helped confirm that lightning and electricity were fundamentally the same phenomenon, a genuinely significant scientific contribution regardless of the exact details. The dramatic version makes for a better bedtime story, sure, but the more cautious, careful Franklin quietly gathering data in a storm feels a lot more true to who he actually was. 33. And speaking of Franklin's fascination with experimentation, not all of his inventions were purely practical. Some were designed purely to create something beautiful. In 1761, Franklin invented the glass harmonica, a musical instrument made from a series of glass bowls of varying sizes, nested on a horizontal spindle, and spun by a foot pedal. The player would touch the rotating rims with wet fingers, producing hauntingly smooth, sustained tones similar to the sound of rubbing a wet finger around a wine glass, but far more refined and controllable. The instrument became remarkably popular throughout Europe, and composers including Mozart and Beethoven wrote pieces specifically for it. Franklin himself was reportedly quite proud of the invention, considering it one of his personal favorites among everything he created. Interestingly, rumors later circulated that the harmonica's eerie tones caused nervous disorders or even madness in listeners and players alike, though most historians today view these claims as exaggerated folklore rather than documented medical fact. The instrument eventually fell out of widespread use during the 19th century, overshadowed by other musical technologies, but it never entirely disappeared. Some musicians and glass artisans still build and play harmonicas today, keeping alive this strange, beautiful, and largely forgotten piece of Franklin's inventive legacy. 34. And speaking of Franklin's legacy taking unexpected turns later in life, one of his final public acts addressed an issue he'd wrestled with for decades. In February of 1790, just months before his death, Franklin, serving as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, signed a petition presented to the newly formed United States Congress urging lawmakers to consider ending slavery and the slave trade. The petition argued that slavery contradicted the fundamental principles of liberty the nation had just fought a revolution to secure. Congress debated the petition, and the discussion grew heated, with several Southern representatives strongly opposing any federal involvement in the issue. Ultimately, Congress declined to act, citing constitutional protections for slavery that had been negotiated during the convention just a few years earlier. Some historians view Franklin's petition as a genuine, if late, moral stand from a man who had once enslaved people himself earlier in his life, before gradually shifting his views. Others note that his timing, arriving so close to the end of his life, raises questions about why the conviction hadn't translated into stronger action decades sooner. Regardless of the complicated timeline, Franklin's final public petition remains a notable moment, a founding father using his last months to formally challenge the institution the new nation had chosen not to confront. 35. And speaking of founding fathers who left lasting marks despite modest physical presence, let's turn to James Madison, often remembered as the architect of the Constitution. Madison was notably small in stature, standing around 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing roughly 100 pounds during much of his adult life, making him one of the smallest men to ever serve as president. Contemporary accounts describe him as soft-spoken, frequently ill, and somewhat reserved in large social gatherings, a stark contrast to more commanding, physically imposing figures like Washington. Yet Madison's influence during the Constitutional Convention was enormous, with many delegates recognizing his intellectual preparation and detailed understanding of political theory as central to shaping the final document. Some historians suggest Madison's quieter, less physically dominant presence actually worked in his favor, allowing him to focus attention on ideas and arguments rather than personality or charisma. Others point out that his health struggles, including recurring seizures throughout his life, may have shaped his careful, methodical approach to both scholarship and governance. Whatever the explanation, Madison's small frame belied an outsized role in American history, a reminder that influence in the founding era wasn't always tied to physical presence, but often to preparation, patience, and a genuine command of ideas. 36. And speaking of Madison's careful, methodical nature, it extended into something historians remain deeply grateful for today. Throughout the Constitutional Convention, in the summer of 1787, Madison took extraordinarily detailed notes, sitting near the front of the room and recording debates, arguments, and votes in painstaking detail, session after session for nearly 4 months. His notes remain the most comprehensive surviving account of what actually happened behind those closed doors, since delegates had agreed to keep proceedings confidential and official records were minimal. Remarkably, Madison chose not to publish these notes during his lifetime, believing it was important for the founding generation's private debates to remain undisclosed until after everyone involved had passed away. His notes were finally published in 1840, 4 years after his death, offering historians their first real window into the convention's disagreements, compromises, and evolving ideas. Some historians praise Madison's restraint, arguing it preserved a valuable historical record without influencing ongoing political battles during his own lifetime. Others wonder how different early American political discourse might have looked had these detailed debates been public knowledge sooner. Either way, Madison's quiet diligence gave future generations an irreplaceable first-hand account of the arguments and negotiations that shaped the very structure of American government. 37. And speaking of Madison's methodical preparation paying off in dramatic fashion, let's look at the actual blueprint he brought to Philadelphia. Before the Constitutional Convention even began, Madison arrived with a detailed proposal now known as the Virginia Plan, largely shaped by his own extensive research into failed governments throughout history. The plan called for a stronger national government than the one under the Articles of Confederation, with power divided among separate legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It also proposed representation based on population, a detail that immediately sparked fierce debate among delegates from smaller states who feared being overwhelmed by larger ones. Madison's plan became the starting point for nearly all subsequent discussions at the convention, essentially setting the agenda for the entire summer. Some historians argue this gave Madison outsized influence over the Constitution's final structure, earning him the informal title Father of the Constitution. Others point out that the final document differed significantly from his original vision, shaped by compromise after compromise with delegates who disagreed with him on key points. Madison himself later expressed some disappointment with certain outcomes, particularly regarding the balance of power between states and the federal government. Still, the Virginia Plan's fingerprints remain visible throughout the Constitution, a testament to how thorough preparation can shape history long before anyone casts a single vote. 38. And speaking of Madison's evolving views, once the framework was in place, his relationship with individual rights took an interesting turn. During the Constitutional Convention itself, Madison was actually somewhat skeptical about adding a Bill of Rights, believing the Constitution's structure alone provided sufficient protection against government overreach. Many delegates agreed, and the original document was ratified without one. However, public pressure during the ratification debates made it clear that many Americans wanted stronger, explicit guarantees of personal freedoms before fully trusting the new government. Madison, ever the pragmatist, changed his position and took on the task of drafting these amendments himself, drawing heavily from existing state constitutions and Enlightenment philosophy. In 1789, he introduced what became the first 10 amendments, covering freedoms like speech, religion, and due process. Some historians view this shift as evidence of Madison's genuine open-mindedness and willingness to adapt his thinking based on public sentiment. Others suggest it was simply savvy politics, a necessary compromise to secure broader support for the government he'd worked so hard to design. Either way, the man who once doubted the necessity of a Bill of Rights ended up authoring the very document that continues to protect individual freedoms in America today, a rather fitting twist for someone so devoted to careful, evolving reasoning. 39. And speaking of Madison facing challenges far more chaotic than convention debates, his presidency included one particularly harrowing chapter. In August of 1814, during the War of 1812, British forces advanced on Washington, D.C., with startling speed, catching American defenses largely unprepared. As reports confirmed the capital was about to fall, Madison made the difficult decision to flee the city alongside government officials, narrowly avoiding capture. Shortly after his departure, British troops entered Washington and set fire to several government buildings, including the Capitol and the White House itself, in retaliation for earlier American actions in Canada. Madison spent several tense days moving between locations in Virginia and Maryland before it was safe to return. Some historians view this episode as a low point in Madison's presidency, highlighting how unprepared the young nation was for foreign invasion so soon after gaining independence. Others note that Madison's ability to maintain government continuity during such chaos, coordinating with cabinet members and eventually returning to rebuild Washington, demonstrated real resilience under extraordinary pressure. Regardless of interpretation, the image of a sitting American president fleeing his own burning capital remains one of the more dramatic and often overlooked moments in the nation's early history. 40. And speaking of dramatic moments during that same chaotic retreat, credit for one particularly memorable rescue belongs not to Madison himself, but to his wife. As British forces closed in on Washington in 1814, Dolly Madison remained behind briefly, insisting on saving what she considered irreplaceable national treasures before evacuating. Most famously, she arranged for the large portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart to be removed from its frame and carried to safety, reportedly instructing servants to break the frame rather than waste precious time unscrewing it properly. Some historical accounts suggest enslaved workers and staff did much of the physical labor involved, a detail modern historians increasingly emphasize when retelling the story. The portrait survived, and today it remains one of the most recognizable images of Washington, ironically saved from destruction by quick thinking during an attack on the very government he helped establish. Dolly Madison's actions that day earned her lasting admiration, transforming her into something of a folk hero in early American memory. Whether driven by genuine reverence for history or simple quick instinct under pressure, her decision preserved a piece of national identity that might otherwise have been lost forever in the flames that consumed so much of Washington that August. 41. And speaking of Dolly Madison's lasting influence beyond that famous rescue, she also helped shape something far more delightful: the social culture surrounding the presidency itself. As First Lady, Dolly Madison became renowned for hosting elaborate, warm, and remarkably well-attended White House gatherings, blending formal politics with genuine social charm in a way few before her had managed. Guests often described her events as lively, inclusive, and refreshingly welcoming compared to the stiffer formality of earlier administrations. Among the many stories surrounding her hospitality, some historians note early references to ice cream being served at White House functions during her time, though whether she was truly the very first to introduce it remains debated among culinary historians. Regardless of who deserves the exact credit, Dolly Madison's association with the treat has persisted in popular memory for generations. Her broader legacy, however, extends well beyond desserts, as she's often credited with helping establish many social traditions and expectations still associated with the modern role of First Lady. Some historians argue her charm and diplomatic instincts occasionally smoothed over political tensions that her more reserved husband struggled to navigate. Whatever the precise details of every anecdote, Dolly Madison's warmth left a surprisingly sweet mark on early American political culture. 42. And speaking of founding figures whose early lives shaped their later ambitions, let's turn briefly to Alexander Hamilton, whose beginnings were quite different from many of his contemporaries. Hamilton was born on the island of Nevis in the British West Indies, though historians still debate his exact birth year, with some records suggesting 1755 and others pointing to 1757. This uncertainty stemmed partly from inconsistent record-keeping in the Caribbean colonies, and partly from Hamilton's own later ambiguity about the details of his childhood. Born out of wedlock and raised amid financial hardship, Hamilton's early life stood in stark contrast to the wealthier, more established backgrounds of many other founding fathers. Some historians suggest this outsider status fueled his intense ambition and drive later in life, pushing him to prove himself repeatedly among more privileged peers. Others note that his sharp intellect became apparent early on, eventually earning him sponsorship from local merchants who recognized his potential and helped fund his education abroad. Whatever the precise details of his earliest years, Hamilton's Caribbean origins remain a fascinating footnote, a reminder that some of America's most influential founding voices came from backgrounds far removed from the courts and plantations most commonly associated with the era. 43. And speaking of Hamilton's sharp intellect finding an outlet, few founding fathers hid behind pseudonyms quite as often as he did. Throughout his career, Hamilton wrote extensively under assumed names, a common practice at the time when political writing could carry real personal and professional risk. Most famously, he authored the majority of the Federalist Papers, the collection of essays defending the newly drafted Constitution, using the shared pen name Publius alongside contributions from James Madison and John Jay. Historians have spent considerable effort untangling exactly which essays belong to which author, since all three men wrote under the same identity and rarely left clear records distinguishing their individual contributions. Some scholars rely on writing style analysis and word patterns to make educated guesses about authorship for the more ambiguous essays. Beyond the Federalist Papers, Hamilton also published numerous anonymous political essays and pamphlets throughout his life, often defending his own policies or attacking rivals under invented names. This practice sometimes blurred the line between public debate and private grudge, since readers rarely knew when Hamilton himself was the one arguing behind the curtain. Whether driven by strategy, humility, or simple habit, Hamilton's anonymous writing remains one of the more fascinating puzzles for historians piecing together his true influence on early American political thought. 44. And speaking of Hamilton's influence extending well beyond anonymous essays, his most lasting impact came through actual policy once he became the nation's first Treasury Secretary. Hamilton proposed a sweeping financial plan designed to stabilize the young nation's shaky economy, one that included having the federal government assume individual states' Revolutionary War debts, consolidating them under national responsibility. He also pushed for the creation of a national bank, modeled partly on the Bank of England, to manage currency and provide financial stability. Additionally, Hamilton advocated for new taxes, including a controversial excise tax on whiskey, to help generate revenue for the federal government. These proposals sparked intense debate among his contemporaries, with figures like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison expressing concern that such centralized financial power exceeded what the Constitution intended. Some historians argue Hamilton's vision effectively created the foundation of modern American capitalism, establishing credit and trust in the federal government early in its existence. Others suggest his approach favored wealthy investors and financial elites at the expense of ordinary farmers and laborers. The whiskey tax alone eventually sparked armed resistance in western Pennsylvania. Regardless of interpretation, Hamilton's financial blueprint reshaped the young republic's economic structure in ways that still echo through American financial institutions today. 45. And speaking of Hamilton's institutional legacies still operating today, one of his lesser-known creations continues protecting American shores. In 1790, Hamilton proposed establishing a fleet of armed vessels tasked with enforcing tariff laws and preventing smuggling along the coastline, a service that became known as the Revenue Marine. At the time, the young nation had no navy to speak of, and Hamilton recognized that unpaid customs duties represented a serious threat to federal revenue and financial stability. The small fleet of cutters patrolled coastal waters, intercepting smugglers and enforcing trade regulations that Hamilton himself had helped design as part of his broader economic vision. Over the following decades, the service gradually expanded its responsibilities, taking on additional duties like maritime rescue and enforcement of various federal laws along the water. Eventually, in the 20th century, the Revenue Marine merged with other maritime services and was officially renamed the United States Coast Guard. Some historians find it fitting that an organization born from Hamilton's obsession with financial order eventually evolved into a broader guardian of American waters, handling everything from search and rescue missions to national security duties. It's a rather understated footnote in Hamilton's legacy, overshadowed by his financial reforms, yet still quietly functioning along America's coastlines more than 2 centuries later. 46. And speaking of Hamilton's fiery temperament occasionally spilling beyond written arguments, his willingness to defend his honor sometimes escalated into far more dangerous territory. Throughout his adult life, Hamilton found himself involved in numerous so-called affairs of honor, formal disputes that occasionally threatened to end in duels, a common if controversial practice among gentlemen of the era for settling personal insults. Historians have documented at least a dozen instances where Hamilton either challenged someone or was challenged himself, though most of these disputes were resolved through negotiation, apology, or the intervention of friends before any shots were actually fired. Hamilton's sharp tongue and unwillingness to back down from political rivals likely contributed to how often he found himself in these tense situations. Tragically, his luck ran out in 1804 when long-simmering political and personal tensions with Vice President Aaron Burr finally reached a breaking point. The two men met at Weehawken, New Jersey, the same dueling ground where Hamilton's own son had died in a duel just 3 years earlier. Accounts of exactly what happened that morning remain somewhat disputed, with historians debating whether Hamilton intentionally fired into the air. Whatever the precise details, Hamilton was mortally wounded and died the following day, bringing a dramatic and permanent end to his long history of confrontations. 47. And speaking of Hamilton's willingness to confront scandal head-on, one particular episode revealed just how far he'd go to protect his public integrity. In the 1790s, Hamilton found himself accused of using his position as Treasury Secretary to secretly funnel government funds to a man named James Reynolds, allegations that threatened to destroy his political career and cast doubt on his financial reforms. To clear his name, Hamilton made an extraordinary decision, publicly admitting that he had indeed paid Reynolds, but for an entirely different reason than corruption. Hamilton revealed he'd been having an affair with Reynolds' wife, Maria, and that the payments were essentially blackmail money to keep the affair quiet, not misused government funds. He published a lengthy pamphlet detailing the entire affair in painstaking, almost uncomfortable detail, hoping to prove his financial conduct remained honest even if his personal behavior had not. Some historians view this as a remarkably transparent, if humiliating, act of self-preservation, protecting his professional reputation at the direct expense of his personal one. Others suggest it reflected Hamilton's genuine belief that public trust in government institutions mattered more than his own private embarrassment. Either way, the scandal became one of early America's first major public sex scandals, forever linking Hamilton's legacy to both financial integrity and personal indiscretion. 48. And speaking of legacies that outlasted the scandals and duels entirely, Hamilton's wife Eliza carried his memory forward for decades after his death. Following Alexander's fatal duel in 1804, Eliza Hamilton lived on for another 50 years, dedicating much of her remaining life to preserving her husband's legacy and continuing charitable work of her own. She worked tirelessly to collect and organize Hamilton's papers, ensuring his contributions to the founding of the nation wouldn't be forgotten or overshadowed by the scandal that marked his final years. Beyond preserving history, Eliza also became deeply involved in charitable efforts addressing poverty and child welfare in New York City. She helped establish the city's first private orphanage, an institution dedicated to caring for children who had lost their parents or been abandoned, a cause she remained personally committed to well into her old age. Some historians note that Eliza's determination and organizational skill mirrored her late husband's own methodical nature, just directed toward social welfare rather than financial policy. Her efforts eventually evolved into what's known today as Graham Windham, an organization still providing services to children and families. Long after Alexander's dramatic death overshadowed his final years, Eliza quietly built her own lasting legacy, one rooted in compassion, resilience, and decades of steady, dedicated work. 49. And speaking of dramatic political moments that nearly derailed the young republic, the election of 1800 produced one of the strangest constitutional crises in American history. Under the original electoral system, electors cast 2 votes without distinguishing between president and vice president, and whoever received the most votes won the presidency while the runner-up became vice president. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, running as a Democratic-Republican ticket, ended up tied with the same number of electoral votes, 73 each. This meant the decision fell to the House of Representatives, which was controlled by the outgoing Federalists, many of whom despised Jefferson. The House deadlocked through 35 separate ballots, with some Federalists reportedly considering throwing their support to Burr just to spite Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton, despite his own rivalry with Jefferson, actively lobbied against Burr, viewing him as dangerously ambitious and untrustworthy. On the 36th ballot, Jefferson finally secured the presidency, with Burr settling for the vice presidency he technically never intended to challenge for. The chaos directly led to the 12th Amendment, which separated electoral votes for president and vice president to prevent future ties like this one. It's a reminder that America's electoral system has been patched and repaired many times over the centuries. 50. And speaking of Aaron Burr's turbulent political career taking even darker turns, his life after the vice presidency reads almost like a spy novel. After leaving office in 1805, Burr traveled west with a group of armed followers and began acquiring land near the Louisiana Territory, activities that quickly aroused suspicion among federal officials. Rumors swirled that Burr intended to carve out an independent nation from Western territories, possibly including parts of Mexico, though historians still debate exactly what he was planning. President Jefferson, who already distrusted Burr deeply, ordered his arrest on charges of treason, accusing him of conspiring to wage war against the United States. The resulting trial in 1807 became a sensational national spectacle, with Chief Justice John Marshall himself presiding over the case. Prosecutors struggled to produce concrete evidence that Burr had actually committed an overt act of treason, since much of the case relied on hearsay and suspicion rather than documented proof. Marshall's strict interpretation of the constitutional definition of treason ultimately worked in Burr's favor, and the jury acquitted him. Some historians view the trial as an early test of due process protections against politically motivated prosecution. Others still wonder whether Burr truly intended empire building or was simply the victim of Jefferson's personal vendetta. Either way, Burr spent the rest of his life rebuilding a reputation that never fully recovered. 51. And speaking of treaties that stirred controversy while quietly preventing bloodshed, John Jay's diplomatic work in 1794 remains a fascinating case of unpopular pragmatism. Sent to negotiate with Britain over lingering tensions from the Revolutionary War, including British forts still occupying American territory and disputes over maritime trade, Jay returned with an agreement that satisfied almost no one. The treaty secured British withdrawal from forts in the Northwest Territory and established a framework for resolving debts and trade disputes, but it failed to address British seizure of American ships or the impressment of American sailors into British service. Many Americans felt Jay had negotiated from a position of weakness, and public outrage was fierce enough that effigies of Jay were burned in several cities. Some political factions accused him of betraying American interests altogether. Despite the backlash, supporters argued the treaty accomplished something crucial, avoiding a second war with Britain at a moment when the fragile young nation could scarcely afford one. Historians remain divided on how favorable the terms truly were, but most agree it bought valuable time for America to stabilize economically and militarily. Jay reportedly joked that he could travel from Boston to Philadelphia, guided entirely by the light of his own burning effigies, a sign of just how deeply unpopular peace sometimes proves to be. 52. And speaking of Jay's complicated legacy extending well beyond treaties with Britain, his work on the issue of slavery reveals another layer of nuance often left out of textbooks. In 1785, Jay helped found the New York Manumission Society, an organization dedicated to promoting the gradual abolition of slavery and improving conditions for free Black New Yorkers. The society established schools for Black children and advocated for legal protections against kidnapping into slavery, a real danger even for those legally free. Notably, Jay himself owned enslaved people during parts of his life, a contradiction that historians often point to when discussing the gap between abolitionist ideals and personal practice among some founding-era figures. Later, as governor of New York, Jay signed legislation in 1799 that established a gradual emancipation timeline for enslaved people within the state, a process that unfolded slowly over the following decades rather than immediately freeing anyone outright. Some historians view Jay's approach as reflecting the political realities of his time, when abolition faced enormous resistance even in northern states. Others argue gradualism prolonged suffering that could have ended sooner. Whatever the interpretation, Jay's anti-slavery efforts represent one of the more overlooked threads of his political career. 53. And speaking of Jay's contributions to foundational American documents, his role in the Federalist Papers is often overshadowed by Hamilton and Madison's more prolific output. Jay originally intended to contribute substantially to the collection of essays defending the newly proposed Constitution, joining Hamilton and Madison under their shared pseudonym Publius. However, Jay fell seriously ill not long after the project began, a bout of sickness that significantly limited how much he could actually write. In the end, Jay authored only 5 of the 85 essays that make up the complete Federalist Papers, a modest contribution compared to Hamilton's dozens of essays. Despite the limited number, Jay's contributions focused heavily on foreign policy and the dangers of disunion, drawing on his own extensive diplomatic experience negotiating with foreign powers. Some historians speculate that had Jay remained healthy throughout the entire project, the balance of authorship and perhaps even the arguments presented might have looked noticeably different. Jay's illness meant Hamilton and Madison shouldered the bulk of the remaining work, cementing their reputations as the primary architects of the collection. It's a small footnote, but a reminder that even monumental historical documents were sometimes shaped as much by circumstance and illness as by careful planning. 54. And speaking of founding figures whose early careers looked nothing like their later fame, Samuel Adams spent years struggling in a rather unglamorous government position before becoming a revolutionary icon. Long before organizing protests against British taxation, Adams worked as a Boston tax collector, a job requiring him to gather payments from local citizens and merchants. Unfortunately, Adams proved remarkably ineffective at the role, consistently falling behind on collections and eventually accumulating significant shortfalls in the funds he was responsible for gathering. Some historians attribute this to genuine financial mismanagement, while others suggest Adams simply sympathized too much with struggling colonists to aggressively pursue payments from them. Whatever the cause, the shortfalls became a serious legal and financial problem, with authorities eventually suing him personally to recover the missing funds. The ordeal dragged on for years, creating financial strain that lingered well into his later political career. Ironically, this same reluctance to squeeze money from ordinary colonists may have shaped his later political philosophy, fueling his passionate opposition to what he viewed as unjust taxation imposed by a distant government. Some historians find a certain poetic symmetry in the fact that a failed tax collector went on to become one of the most vocal opponents of taxation without representation in American history. 55. And speaking of Samuel Adams and his complicated relationship with organized resistance, his exact role in the Boston Tea Party remains more mysterious than most textbooks let on. Adams was undeniably one of the loudest voices opposing the Tea Act, arguing passionately at town meetings that the tax represented yet another example of Parliament imposing rules on colonists who had no say in the matter. He helped organize the mass meetings that preceded the tea's destruction in December 1773, rallying support and channeling public anger toward action. However, historians still debate whether Adams actually helped plan the specific act of dumping tea into Boston Harbor, or whether he simply provided the political framework that made such an action feel justified. Adams himself was notably vague about his involvement in later years, neither fully claiming credit nor denying participation. Some accounts suggest he knew exactly what was being planned and quietly approved. Others argue he preferred plausible deniability, letting younger and less politically exposed colonists handle the actual destruction of property. Either way, Adams became forever linked to an event whose precise planning details remain genuinely unclear, a small mystery hiding inside one of the most famous protests in American history. 56. And speaking of famous moments whose exact details have grown blurrier with time, Patrick Henry's legendary Declaration of Liberty or Death exists in a strange historical fog. Henry delivered his fiery speech before the Virginia Convention in 1775, reportedly arguing passionately that the colonies must prepare for armed resistance against British rule. The problem is that no verbatim transcript from anyone actually present that day has ever been found. The version most Americans know today wasn't published until decades later, reconstructed largely from the memory of William Wirt, a biographer who interviewed elderly witnesses long after Henry's death. Some historians argue Wirt's version captures the spirit of what Henry said, even if the precise wording was reconstructed rather than recorded in real time. Others suggest the speech may have been embellished or dramatized to fit the patriotic mythology growing around the revolution. Without contemporary shorthand notes or an original manuscript, we're left relying on secondhand memory filtered through decades of retelling. It's a fascinating example of how iconic historical quotes sometimes owe as much to storytelling and legacy building as to precise documentation. 57. And speaking of Patrick Henry stirring passionate debate, his skepticism didn't end with the revolution. He became one of the fiercest opponents of ratifying the Constitution itself. Henry worried deeply that a stronger federal government would inevitably swallow the individual liberties and state autonomy that the revolution had just fought to secure. He argued forcefully during Virginia's ratification debates that the proposed Constitution concentrated far too much power in a distant central authority, echoing the very fears that had driven colonists to rebel against Britain in the first place. Henry famously refused to attend the Constitutional Convention altogether, reportedly stating he smelled a rat, suspicious that something was being planned that would undermine state sovereignty. His opposition helped fuel demands for a Bill of Rights, since many anti-federalists shared his concerns that individual freedoms needed explicit protection against government overreach. Though Virginia ultimately ratified the Constitution, Henry's persistent warnings arguably shaped the eventual inclusion of the first 10 amendments. Some historians view him as a stubborn obstacle to necessary progress. Others consider him a prescient voice warning against the dangers of centralized power. Either way, his fingerprints remain on the safeguards Americans still rely on today. 58. And speaking of dramatic revolutionary moments that didn't go exactly as popular memory suggests, Paul Revere's midnight ride actually ended with him detained by British soldiers before he ever reached his final destination. Revere set out on the night of April 18, 1775, warning colonial militia that British troops were marching toward Lexington and Concord. He successfully alerted key figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, but partway through his journey, a British patrol intercepted him. Revere was questioned, briefly held, and ultimately had his horse confiscated before being released to walk the rest of the way on foot. This meant he never actually completed the full ride to Concord as popularly imagined. Fellow writers William Dawes and Samuel Prescott played crucial roles in spreading the warning further, with Prescott actually being the one who successfully reached Concord to alert militia there. Despite this, Revere's name became the one immortalized in American memory, largely thanks to a famous poem written decades later. Some historians argue the poem oversimplified a coordinated group effort into a single heroic narrative, turning one participant among several into the enduring symbol of the entire warning system. 59. And speaking of historical figures whose fame rests on a single dramatic moment, Paul Revere's life involved far more than one legendary ride through the Massachusetts countryside. Revere worked primarily as a silversmith, crafting intricate silverware, engravings, and decorative items that were highly regarded throughout colonial Boston. He also produced engravings used for political propaganda, including a famous depiction of the Boston Massacre that helped shape public opinion against British soldiers. Beyond artistry, Revere ventured into dentistry, reportedly wiring false teeth into place for patients, a skill that some historians believe helped him later identify the remains of a fallen soldier through dental work. He later expanded into industrial pursuits, establishing a foundry that produced cannons, bells, and eventually rolled copper sheeting used to sheath the hulls of naval ships. His copper business became successful enough that it evolved into a company still operating today under a different name. Revere's ability to move fluidly between fine craftsmanship, political activism, dentistry, and industrial manufacturing paints a picture of a remarkably versatile figure whose historical reputation as merely a horseback messenger barely scratches the surface of his actual accomplishments. 60. And speaking of famous signals sent to warn colonial militia, the lanterns hung in Boston's Old North Church carried a very specific meaning that night in April 1775. The plan involved signaling how British troops planned to approach, since colonial leaders needed advance warning to properly position their militia forces. One lantern would indicate that troops were marching by land, while two lanterns signaled that troops were crossing the Charles River by boat. On the night of Revere's ride, two lanterns were indeed lit, confirming that British soldiers were moving by water rather than the longer overland route. This system allowed messengers to spread warning quickly, even if writers like Revere were captured or delayed along the way. Robert Newman, the church sexton, is generally credited with climbing the steeple to hang the signal lanterns, reportedly taking considerable personal risks since British soldiers occupied the city at the time. The signal itself was visible only briefly, meant to be seen by watchers positioned across the river in Charlestown. This simple two-lantern code became one of the most enduring symbols of coordinated revolutionary resistance, immortalized forever by the phrase 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. 61. And speaking of signals and symbols that became permanently attached to a single name, John Hancock's signature on the Declaration of Independence became so iconic that his name is now shorthand for any signature at all. Hancock signed first, and he signed big, his flowing script dominating the top of the document in a way no one else's did. The popular legend claims he wanted King George to be able to read it without his spectacles, a bold act of defiance against the crown. The more mundane explanation is simply that Hancock was president of the Continental Congress at the time, and tradition dictated that the presiding officer signed first and most prominently. Other delegates didn't add their names until weeks later, once the document had been formally engrossed. Hancock's outsized signature has since become a permanent fixture in American vocabulary, with people asking for a John Hancock on everything from mortgages to birthday cards. Whether he intended a dramatic act of rebellion or was simply following procedural custom, historians still debate. What's certain is that his penmanship outlived him in a way few founders could have predicted, turning one man's handwriting into a universal symbol for putting your name on the dotted line. 62. And speaking of John Hancock leaving his mark in unexpected ways, his fortune actually came from a business that occasionally brushed up against British law. Hancock inherited a thriving merchant shipping empire from his uncle, and he expanded it significantly through Atlantic trade routes carrying goods like tea, wine, and textiles. Some historians suggest portions of this trade involved skirting British customs regulations, since strict import duties made smuggling an attractive option for many colonial merchants trying to maximize profit. Customs officials reportedly investigated some of Hancock's shipments, suspicious that not everything was being properly declared or taxed. Whether Hancock personally orchestrated any illegal activity or whether his captains and agents handled the riskier details remains genuinely unclear, since definitive records are scarce. What's certain is that Hancock became one of the wealthiest men in Boston, using his fortune to fund charitable causes, political campaigns, and eventually the revolutionary cause itself. His willingness to bankroll resistance efforts made him enormously popular among colonists frustrated with British taxation. Some historians argue his business dealings gave him a very personal stake in opposing customs enforcement, blending patriotic conviction with practical self-interest in a way that made him one of the revolution's most complicated financial backers. 63. And speaking of customs officials taking a little too much interest in Hancock's business, one seizure in particular helped ignite public fury across Boston. In 1768, British officials confiscated Hancock's sloop Liberty, claiming its crew had violated customs regulations by unloading wine without properly paying duties. The seizure sparked immediate outrage among Bostonians, who viewed it as yet another example of British overreach against colonial merchants. Crowds gathered, tensions escalated, and customs officials reportedly had to flee for safety as protests grew increasingly hostile. The incident became a rallying point for colonists already frustrated with taxation policies, reinforcing Hancock's reputation as a defender of colonial economic rights rather than merely a wealthy businessman protecting his own interests. Some historians argue the Liberty affair was less about principle and more about protecting Hancock's profits, since the ship's seizure directly threatened his livelihood. Others suggest the event genuinely galvanized public sentiment against British customs enforcement, regardless of Hancock's personal motivations. Either way, the seizure of a single ship named Liberty became a symbolic flashpoint, illustrating how economic grievances and political ideology intertwined in the years leading up to revolution. 64. And speaking of founders whose personal backgrounds shaped their political convictions, John Witherspoon brought a distinctly Scottish perspective to the fight for American independence. Witherspoon immigrated from Scotland to serve as president of the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton, bringing with him a reputation as a respected Presbyterian minister and scholar. He was notably the only member of the clergy to sign the Declaration of Independence, a fact that surprised some colonists who assumed religious leaders would remain neutral on matters of political rebellion. Witherspoon argued that supporting independence aligned with both moral principle and religious conviction, framing resistance to tyranny as a legitimate expression of faith rather than a departure from it. His involvement lent significant credibility to the revolutionary cause among religious communities who might otherwise have hesitated to support armed rebellion against a ruling monarch. Some historians suggest his participation helped bridge the gap between religious institutions and political radicalism during a period when many clergy remained cautious about openly defying British authority. Witherspoon's willingness to sign his name alongside lawyers, merchants, and planters demonstrated that revolutionary sentiment crossed professional and religious boundaries, uniting an unusually diverse group of signers under a shared cause. 65. And speaking of John Witherspoon's influence extending far beyond his own signature, his classroom at Princeton quietly shaped the future of American governance. Witherspoon taught a remarkable number of students who later became prominent political figures, including James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution. Madison studied directly under Witherspoon, absorbing lessons in moral philosophy, rhetoric, and political theory that some historians argue directly influenced his later constitutional thinking. Beyond Madison, Witherspoon's students went on to become delegates, judges, and government officials across the newly formed nation, creating a network of leaders who had all passed through the same lecture halls. His teaching emphasized reasoned debate, civic responsibility, and the practical application of philosophical principles to real governance, skills that proved invaluable during the constitutional debates that followed. Some historians describe Princeton under Witherspoon as an unintentional training ground for revolutionary leadership, producing an outsized number of influential figures relative to other colonial institutions. Whether this reflects Witherspoon's exceptional teaching, or simply the ambitions of the students who sought him out, remains debated, but his classroom's fingerprints are unmistakably present throughout early American political history. 66. And speaking of founders whose contributions span multiple pivotal documents, Roger Sherman holds a distinction that no other American can claim. Sherman is the only person to have signed all four of the nation's founding documents: the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. This remarkable consistency placed him at the center of nearly every major political transition during America's founding era, from initial protests against British trade policy through the eventual creation of a lasting federal government. Sherman was known less for fiery rhetoric and more for practical compromise, playing a key role in brokering the Connecticut Compromise, which balanced representation between larger and smaller states during constitutional debates. Some historians argue his quiet, methodical approach made him one of the most effective yet underappreciated founders, someone who prioritized functional government over personal glory. Others suggest his willingness to compromise occasionally frustrated more idealistic delegates who wanted bolder declarations of principle. Regardless, his signature appearing on all four documents remains a unique historical footnote, a testament to steady, behind-the-scenes involvement across 2 decades of dramatic political transformation that few other founders can match. 67. And speaking of quiet compromise shaping the Constitution's very structure, Roger Sherman wasn't working alone when he helped design America's bicameral Congress. What's often called the Connecticut Compromise, or sometimes the Great Compromise, resolved one of the most contentious debates of the entire convention: how should representation actually work in a new government? Larger states wanted representation based on population, believing their greater numbers deserved greater influence. Smaller states feared being permanently outvoted and demanded equal representation regardless of size. Sherman's proposal split the difference, creating a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate where every state, large or small, received equal footing. Some historians argue this compromise saved the entire convention from collapsing, since several small state delegates had reportedly threatened to walk out entirely. Others suggest the solution created lasting tension between popular democracy and state equality that still shapes American politics today. Whether you view the Senate's structure as a brilliant safeguard against majority tyranny or an outdated relic of 18th century negotiation, its origins trace directly back to a tense summer in Philadelphia when compromise, rather than idealism, kept 13 states at the same table. 68. And speaking of documents that quietly shaped everything that came after, George Mason's writing influenced American rights long before the Constitution existed. Mason authored the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, a sweeping statement asserting that all people possess inherent rights to life, liberty, and property. The document also emphasized freedom of the press, religious liberty, and protection against cruel punishment, ideas that felt strikingly modern for their time. Thomas Jefferson reportedly drew inspiration from Mason's language when drafting the Declaration of Independence just weeks later, borrowing both structure and philosophical framing. Mason's influence didn't stop there. Decades later, when the Federal Bill of Rights was drafted, many of its core protections echoed language Mason had already established at the state level. Some historians consider Mason one of the most underappreciated founders, someone whose ideas shaped the nation's founding vocabulary without his name becoming as widely recognized as Jefferson's or Madison's. Others note that Mason's vision extended beyond what many contemporaries were comfortable enshrining nationally. Regardless, the Virginia Declaration of Rights remains a foundational blueprint, quietly influencing American rights protections that citizens still invoke today, often without realizing where the language truly began. 69. And speaking of founders whose principles sometimes put them at odds with their peers, George Mason made a decision that surprised many delegates in Philadelphia. Despite playing a significant role in shaping the Constitution's early drafts, Mason ultimately refused to sign the finished document. His primary objection centered on the absence of a Bill of Rights, something he considered essential for protecting individual liberties from potential government overreach. Mason argued that without explicit protections, the new federal government could theoretically infringe on freedoms the states had long guaranteed. He also expressed concerns about the strength of the proposed executive branch and the continuation of the slave trade, believing the Constitution left too many critical issues unresolved. Some historians argue Mason's refusal reflected genuine principled concern for individual liberty, while others suggest personal frustration with how negotiations unfolded may have influenced his decision as well. Whatever the exact mixture of motives, Mason's stance carried weight. His insistence on a Bill of Rights helped fuel the push that eventually led to the first 10 amendments, being added just a few years later, meaning the document he refused to sign was ultimately reshaped by the very objections he raised. 70. And speaking of founders whose names became permanently attached to something they probably never wanted to be famous for, Elbridge Gerry unintentionally gave America a lasting political term. In 1812, while serving as governor of Massachusetts, Gerry approved a redistricting plan that reshaped voting districts to favor his political party. One newly drawn district reportedly resembled the curved, elongated shape of a salamander, prompting a newspaper cartoonist to dub it a gerrymander, combining Gerry's name with the creature's silhouette. The term stuck, eventually becoming shorthand for any manipulation of electoral boundaries designed to benefit a particular political group. Some historians argue Gerry himself wasn't entirely enthusiastic about the plan and simply signed off on a proposal crafted by his party's legislature. Others suggest he understood exactly what the redistricting accomplished and approved it willingly for political advantage. Either way, the practice of manipulating district lines for partisan gain didn't begin with Gerry, and it certainly didn't end with him either. It remains a contentious feature of American elections today. What's remarkable is that a single approved map and one clever cartoonist permanently linked Gerry's name to a practice debated in courtrooms and legislatures more than 2 centuries later. 71. And speaking of Elbridge Gerry's complicated legacy, his role at the Constitutional Convention reveals a founder who supported independence but resisted the final product. Gerry attended the Philadelphia Convention as a delegate from Massachusetts, actively participating in debates over representation, executive power, and legislative structure. Despite his involvement throughout the summer of 1787, Gerry ultimately declined to sign the completed Constitution, joining a small group of dissenting delegates who felt the document needed significant changes before earning their support. His objections included concerns about the power granted to the federal government and the absence of a Bill of Rights, concerns shared by fellow dissenters like George Mason. Some historians argue Gerry's refusal demonstrated genuine principle, a willingness to prioritize his convictions over convention pressure to present a unified front. Others suggest his hesitation reflected broader anxieties among many Americans who worried the new government might replicate the very tyranny they had just fought to escape. Jerry later became a vocal anti-federalist during ratification debates, arguing publicly against adopting the Constitution as written. Ironically, he would later serve as vice president under a government built from the very document he once refused to endorse, a contradiction historians still find fascinating. 72. And speaking of founders whose influence lived in the wording rather than the ideas themselves, Gouverneur Morris deserves credit for much of the Constitution's final language. Morris served on the Committee of Style, tasked with taking the convention's agreed-upon principles and transforming them into clear, cohesive text. Historians widely credit him with writing the majority of the document's final draft, smoothing inconsistencies and sharpening language that had emerged from months of compromise and debate. Perhaps his most enduring contribution was the preamble, the sweeping opening statement beginning with "We the People," a phrase that reframed the entire document as an act of popular sovereignty rather than a mere agreement among states. Some historians argue this phrasing subtly shifted the Constitution's philosophical foundation, emphasizing national unity over state-based authority. Morris reportedly took creative liberties with wording throughout the document, occasionally adjusting phrasing to reflect his own political leanings toward stronger federal power. Other delegates apparently trusted his literary skill enough not to scrutinize every adjustment closely. Whether intentional political shaping or simple stylistic refinement, Morris's pen gave the Constitution its lasting voice, turning collective negotiation into language still recited, debated, and interpreted more than 2 centuries later. 73. And speaking of Gouverneur Morris's lasting contributions to the Constitution's language, his personal life carried its own physical hardship that shaped how history remembers him. In 1780, years before the convention, Morris was involved in a serious carriage accident that resulted in the loss of one of his legs. For the remainder of his life, he relied on a wooden prosthetic limb, navigating both physical recovery and the social attention that came with such a visible disability in 18th century society. Some accounts from the era suggest political rivals occasionally used the injury to mock him, while others describe Morris as remarkably unbothered, continuing his diplomatic and political work without apparent hesitation. He traveled extensively, served as a minister to France, and remained active in debates despite the physical challenges his injury presented. Historians sometimes point to this resilience as evidence of Morris's determined personality, the same tenacity that allowed him to reshape the Constitution's final wording during exhausting months of negotiation. Whether the accident shaped his character or simply revealed a toughness already present, Morris's ability to continue contributing at the highest levels of early American government, prosthetic leg and all, remains a quietly remarkable footnote to a life already filled with influence. 74. And speaking of founders whose behind-the-scenes work kept the revolution financially alive, Robert Morris used his extensive business connections to help fund the war effort when the fledgling government had almost nothing to work with. As a wealthy Philadelphia merchant, Morris leveraged personal credit, trade relationships, and financial expertise to secure loans, purchase supplies, and keep struggling Continental forces equipped during some of the war's most desperate moments. He's often credited with helping arrange the funding that allowed Washington's army to move troops and supplies before the pivotal Yorktown campaign, a logistical effort some historians argue was just as essential to victory as any battlefield strategy. Morris essentially became the revolution's financial improviser, patching together resources through personal reputation and private networks when official government credit simply didn't exist yet. Some scholars view this as an extraordinary act of patriotism, a wealthy man risking his own fortune and reputation for a cause with uncertain odds of success. Others note that Morris also profited from certain wartime contracts, suggesting his motivations blended genuine commitment with practical business interest. Either way, without his financial maneuvering, revolutionary forces may have struggled considerably more just to stay supplied. 75. And speaking of Robert Morris's financial ingenuity during the Revolution, his story took a dramatically different turn once the war ended. Despite being celebrated as the financier of the Revolution, Morris later invested heavily in speculative land deals that ultimately collapsed under mounting debt. By the 1790s, his once impressive fortune had evaporated, and creditors began pursuing him aggressively for repayment. In 1798, Morris was arrested and imprisoned for unpaid debts, spending more than 3 years confined to debtor's prison, a stunning fall for a man who had once helped fund an entire war. Some historians view this as a cautionary tale about the volatility of speculative investment in the young nation's uncertain economy. Others suggest Morris simply overextended himself, trusting opportunities that seemed promising at the time, but ultimately proved unstable. Regardless of the reasoning behind his financial collapse, the contrast remains striking. A man once essential to America's survival, later confined behind prison walls for the very financial risk-taking that had once made him indispensable. Morris was eventually released, though his once towering reputation never fully recovered before his death in relative obscurity. 76. And speaking of founders whose personal identity set them apart from nearly everyone else in the room, Charles Carroll holds a distinction unmatched among the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Carroll was the only Catholic to sign the document, a notable detail given the widespread religious discrimination Catholics faced throughout many of the colonies during that era. In several colonies, Catholics faced legal restrictions limiting their ability to vote, hold office, or practice their faith openly, making Carroll's prominent political role somewhat unusual for the time. Some historians argue his wealth and elite social standing in Maryland helped him navigate barriers that would have blocked less affluent Catholics from similar influence. Others suggest his willingness to publicly commit treason against the British crown by signing the Declaration carried especially high personal risk, given how visibly his religious identity already set him apart. Carroll reportedly added his home address next to his signature, ensuring the British couldn't claim confusion about which Charles Carroll had committed to independence. Whether viewed as a symbol of religious inclusion within the founding generation, or simply an exception within a broader pattern of exclusion, Carroll's signature remains a distinctive piece of revolutionary history. 77. And speaking of Charles Carroll's remarkable place in founding history, his life extended far beyond the Revolution itself, quietly outlasting every other signer of the Declaration of Independence. Carroll lived until 1832, making him the final surviving signer and witnessing the young nation grow for decades after independence was first declared. By the time of his death, the country had expanded dramatically, undergone a War of 1812, and seen the deaths of nearly every other founder who had once stood alongside him in Philadelphia. Some historians find symbolic significance in Carroll's longevity, viewing him as a living link between the revolutionary generation and a rapidly changing 19th century America. Others simply note that his long life allowed him to become something of a celebrated relic, honored publicly in his final years as the last physical connection to that pivotal moment of 1776. Carroll reportedly received visitors and public recognition throughout his later life, treated almost as a walking piece of history. When he finally passed away at the age of 95, an era genuinely ended, closing the final chapter on the generation that had personally signed America's Declaration of Independence. 78. And speaking of founders whose words set independence into motion before Jefferson ever picked up his pen, Richard Henry Lee formally introduced the resolution that started it all. In June of 1776, Lee stood before the Continental Congress and proposed that the colonies were, and rightfully ought to be, free and independent states, a direct challenge demanding formal separation from British rule. This proposal, often called the Lee Resolution, became the foundational trigger prompting Congress to appoint a committee, including Jefferson, to draft a formal declaration explaining that decision to the world. Some historians argue Lee deserves far more recognition than he typically receives, since his resolution technically initiated the process that led directly to the Declaration of Independence itself. Others note that Jefferson's eloquent drafting ultimately overshadowed Lee's more procedural, though equally essential, contribution. Lee's resolution passed on July 2nd, a date John Adams believed would be remembered as America's true Independence Day, rather than July 4th, when the Declaration's language was formally adopted. Whether remembered as a footnote or a foundation, Lee's bold proposal turned growing colonial frustration into an official, irreversible declaration of political intent. 79. And speaking of founders whose families paid a steep personal price for their signatures, Francis Lewis of New York suffered one of the more devastating personal losses of the entire Revolution. When British forces occupied Long Island, they specifically targeted Lewis's property, destroying his home and estate as punishment, for his role in declaring independence. His wife, Elizabeth, was captured and imprisoned under harsh conditions for several months, with limited food and no proper bedding, before being released through a prisoner exchange arranged partly through the efforts of General Washington. Some historians suggest Elizabeth Lewis never fully recovered from the ordeal, and she passed away a few years later, her health permanently damaged by the imprisonment. Others note that Francis Lewis rarely spoke publicly about the experience, focusing instead on his continued congressional duties despite personal tragedy at home. The destruction of his property left him in considerably reduced financial circumstances for the remainder of his life, a quiet but significant sacrifice compared to the more celebrated wartime losses of other founders. Lewis's story serves as a reminder that the war's consequences often fell most heavily on families, not just soldiers or statesmen, waiting anxiously behind the lines. 80. And speaking of signers whose personal conflicts proved just as dangerous as any battlefield, Button Gwinnett of Georgia met his end in a way entirely unrelated to British muskets. Gwinnett, involved in Georgia's often turbulent state politics, developed a bitter rivalry with fellow military leader Lachlan McIntosh, reportedly stemming from disputes over military command and political maneuvering within the state. Their disagreement escalated until the two men agreed to settle it through a formal duel in 1777. Gwinnett was wounded during the exchange, and though accounts vary on the severity of the injury, he died just days later, likely from complications or infection rather than the gunshot itself. Some historians view the duel as a symptom of the deep political factionalism plaguing Georgia's fragile revolutionary government at the time. Others argue Gwinnett's death robbed Georgia of a capable, if controversial, leader during a critical period of the war. Because Gwinnett died relatively young and left behind few surviving documents, he remains one of the most obscure and mysterious signers of the Declaration, his signature far more famous today than the details of the man who wrote it. 81. And speaking of signers whose fortunes rose and fell dramatically alongside the Revolution itself, Carter Braxton of Virginia experienced a financial collapse that mirrored the instability of the era he helped shape. Before the war, Braxton was among the wealthiest planters in Virginia, with extensive land holdings and prosperous trade connections. However, his investments in shipping and mercantile ventures suffered enormous losses once British naval blockades disrupted colonial trade routes. Some historians suggest Braxton's financial troubles were worsened by risky loans and speculative ventures that failed to recover after the war's economic disruptions. Others argue his wealth was simply too tied to trade networks that the revolution inevitably destabilized, making his losses more circumstantial than reckless. By the final years of his life, Braxton had sold off much of his property just to manage mounting debts, a stark contrast to his earlier reputation as one of Virginia's elite gentry. Braxton's story stands as another example of how signing the Declaration carried financial risks that extended well beyond the battlefield, sometimes quietly unraveling fortunes built over generations in just a few short years of war. 82. And speaking of founders whose households included lesser-known but historically significant figures, William Whipple of New Hampshire brought an enslaved man named Prince Whipple with him during his service in the Continental Army. Prince Whipple is believed by some historians to be depicted in the famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, though this identification remains debated among scholars. Accounts suggest Prince served alongside William Whipple during military campaigns, and some historians believe his presence influenced William's eventual decision to grant him freedom, possibly linked to promises made regarding wartime service. The exact timeline and circumstances of Prince Whipple's emancipation remain unclear, with limited documentation surviving from the period. After gaining freedom, Prince Whipple settled in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he became an active and respected member of the local black community until his death in 1796. Some historians view his story as an important reminder of the often overlooked contributions and complex realities faced by enslaved individuals connected to prominent founding families. Others caution that many details remain speculative, pieced together from fragmentary historical records rather than complete documentation, leaving much of Prince Whipple's personal story still shrouded in uncertainty. 83. And speaking of signers who quietly protected the fragile economy of a nation still finding its footing, Oliver Wolcott of Connecticut played an important role in combating a very specific wartime threat: British-backed counterfeit currency. During the Revolution, British agents deliberately flooded the colonies with fake continental currency, hoping to destabilize the American economy and undermine public confidence in its new government. Wolcott, already active in Connecticut's wartime administration, helped coordinate efforts to identify counterfeit bills and support measures aimed at protecting the integrity of the colony's financial systems. Some historians argue this counterfeiting campaign caused as much damage to the American cause as any military engagement, fueling inflation and eroding trust in the young nation's currency. Others note that Wolcott's contributions in this area were largely administrative, less dramatic than battlefield heroics, but nonetheless essential to keeping the revolutionary government functioning. Wolcott later went on to serve as Connecticut's governor, building on the quiet reputation for steady, behind-the-scenes governance he first developed during the war. His financial vigilance remains a lesser-known but genuinely important thread in the larger story of how the revolution was sustained. 84. And speaking of founders whose professional training shaped their approach to public service, Lyman Hall of Georgia arrived in politics only after establishing himself as a physician. Hall studied medicine and practiced for years before growing increasingly involved in the political tensions building between the colonies and Britain. Some historians suggest his medical background gave him a practical, grounded perspective that influenced his approach to public service, prioritizing steady problem solving over political theatrics. Others note that his transition from medicine to full-time politics reflected a broader pattern among educated colonial professionals who felt compelled to become directly involved as revolutionary sentiment intensified. Hall's medical career gave him financial stability and social standing within his community, both of which likely supported his rise into Georgia's political leadership. After signing the Declaration, Hall continued serving Georgia in various capacities, eventually becoming the state's governor after the war concluded. His path from tending patients to helping draft the founding documents of a new nation illustrates how varied and unexpected the routes to revolutionary leadership often were, with plenty of Georgia's signers arriving from surprisingly ordinary professional backgrounds rather than lifelong political ambition. 85. And speaking of last-minute journeys that changed the course of history, Caesar Rodney of Delaware made one of the most dramatic rides of the entire Revolutionary period, though it had nothing to do with Paul Revere's more famous Midnight Warning. In July of 1776, Delaware's delegation was split on the question of independence, and Rodney, who supported the measure, was away attending to militia duties when word arrived that a crucial vote was imminent. Some accounts describe Rodney riding through a violent thunderstorm, covering roughly 80 miles on horseback through the night to reach Philadelphia in time. He arrived, according to popular retellings, still in his riding boots and splattered with mud, just in time to cast the deciding vote that swung Delaware toward independence. Historians note that Rodney was also dealing with serious health issues at the time, including a facial cancer that he covered with a green silk scarf, making the journey even more physically demanding than it already sounds. Whether every detail of the ride has been embellished over the centuries remains debated, but the core outcome is well documented. Rodney's timely arrival ensured Delaware's vote counted, a reminder that independence sometimes hinged on exhausting, uncomfortable, and thoroughly unglamorous logistics. 86. And speaking of documents that went through more changes than most people realize, Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence looked noticeably different from the version eventually adopted by Congress. Jefferson worked initially with input from Benjamin Franklin and John Adams before submitting the draft to the wider Continental Congress for review. What followed was days of debate, line editing and revision, with delegates removing, rewording, and rearranging passages throughout the document. Some historians estimate that Congress made dozens of changes, trimming roughly a quarter of Jefferson's original text in the process. Jefferson reportedly found the editing process frustrating, later describing some of the changes as unnecessary or even damaging to the document's original spirit. Others argue the collaborative editing actually strengthened the final text, tightening the language and ensuring broader support among delegates who might have objected to more specific or inflammatory phrasing. The final version approved on July 4th represented a group effort rather than a single author's vision, shaped by compromise as much as conviction. It's a detail often lost in the popular imagination of Jefferson quietly penning the document alone, when in reality it was very much a product of committee. 87. And speaking of dates that don't quite match popular memory, The famous image of delegates lining up to sign the Declaration on July 4th, 1776, isn't entirely accurate. Congress actually voted to approve the document's language on July 4th, but the formal engrossed copy, the elegant handwritten version most people picture today, wasn't ready for signatures until weeks later. Most historians agree that the bulk of the signing took place on August 2nd, 1776, when delegates gathered to add their names to the official parchment copy. Some signers weren't even present on that date and added their signatures over the following months as they returned to Congress. A few delegates who had voted for independence in July never signed at all, while others who signed later hadn't been part of the original vote. This staggered signing process reflects just how gradual and administratively messy the whole affair actually was, far removed from the tidy single-moment ceremony often depicted in paintings and reenactments. The famous document we picture as a snapshot of one dramatic day was, in reality, the product of a much longer and quieter bureaucratic process. 88. And speaking of drafts that reveal more than the final product ever did, Jefferson's original rough draft of the Declaration contained passages that never made it into the version Congress approved. Perhaps the most notable of these was a lengthy condemnation of the transatlantic slave trade, which Jefferson included as part of his list of grievances against King George III. Congress ultimately removed this passage entirely, a decision historians attribute to pressure from delegates representing Southern colonies, as well as concerns from some Northern merchants involved in the slave trade themselves. Some historians view this omission as a significant and telling moment, revealing the deep contradictions surrounding slavery, even among founders advocating for liberty and self-governance. Others note that Jefferson himself owned enslaved people at the time he wrote the passage, complicating interpretations of his motivations for including it in the first place. The removed text survives today in Jefferson's personal papers, offering historians a rare glimpse into debates that shaped, and limited, the document's final language. It stands as one of the clearer examples of how political compromise shaped the founding era, sometimes stripping away language that might have set the new nation on a very different course from its very beginning. 89. And speaking of governing documents that took far longer to finalize than most people assume, the Articles of Confederation followed a surprisingly slow and complicated path toward full ratification. Congress approved the Articles in November of 1777, establishing the framework for a loose confederation of states during the ongoing war effort. However, unanimous approval from all 13 states proved difficult to secure, largely due to disputes over Western land claims and how those territories would be managed under the new government. Maryland, in particular, refused to ratify the Articles until states with large Western land claims agreed to cede that territory to the collective national government. This standoff dragged on for years, delaying full ratification until March of 1781, nearly 4 years after Congress had initially approved the document. Some historians argue this delay reflects the deep tensions between individual state interests and the broader national project, tensions that would continue shaping American governance for decades. Others note that the prolonged ratification process highlighted just how fragile and improvised the young Confederation truly was during a period when unified action was desperately needed against a common wartime enemy. 90. And speaking of turning points that pushed founders towards stronger central governance, Shays' Rebellion in 1786 and 1787 exposed weaknesses that many influential figures had feared but hadn't yet fully confronted. Led by Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army officer, the uprising involved indebted farmers in western Massachusetts protesting aggressive debt collection and property seizures during a period of severe economic hardship. The rebellion revealed that the Articles of Confederation government lacked the authority and resources to effectively respond to internal unrest, relying instead on privately funded militia to suppress the uprising. Some historians argue this event served as a decisive wake-up call, convincing key leaders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton that a stronger federal framework was urgently needed. Others suggest the rebellion's influence has sometimes been overstated, noting that calls for constitutional reform were already gaining momentum before the unrest even began. Regardless of its exact weight in the decision-making process, Shays' Rebellion is widely regarded as a significant symbolic moment, one that added urgency to the movement culminating in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It stands as a clear example of how domestic instability, not just foreign threats, helped shape the structure of American government moving forward. 91. And speaking of decisions that shaped how the entire Constitution came together, the secrecy surrounding the Constitutional Convention of 1787 remains one of the more remarkable aspects of that summer in Philadelphia. Delegates agreed early on to keep their debates completely private, posting guards at the doors and swearing everyone present to confidentiality. Windows were reportedly kept shut despite the sweltering heat, partly to prevent eavesdroppers from hearing the arguments taking place inside. The reasoning was straightforward. Delegates wanted the freedom to propose ideas, argue positions, and change their minds without worrying that half-formed opinions would end up in newspapers the next morning. Some historians argue this secrecy allowed for genuine compromise, letting delegates negotiate difficult issues like representation and federal power without public pressure complicating every exchange. Others note that the closed-door approach meant the American public had no direct insight into how their new government was actually being designed, relying entirely on secondhand summaries once the convention concluded. James Madison's detailed notes, not published until after his death decades later, remain one of the only surviving first-hand accounts of what actually happened inside that room. It's a striking reminder that the document defining American governance was debated entirely behind closed doors. 92. And speaking of compromises that reveal just how contested the Constitution's creation truly was, the Three-Fifths Compromise stands as one of the most debated provisions to emerge from the 1787 convention. The agreement determined that enslaved individuals would be counted as three-fifths of a person for purposes of congressional representation and direct taxation. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted fully to increase their political representation, while Northern delegates argued they shouldn't be counted at all, since enslaved individuals had no legal rights or citizenship. The three-fifths formula emerged as a negotiated middle ground, satisfying neither side completely but allowing the convention to move forward. Historians widely view this compromise as reflecting the deep and painful contradictions built into the nation's founding, balancing political necessity against the fundamental humanity of enslaved people. Some scholars argue the compromise gave Southern states disproportionate political power for decades afterward, influencing everything from presidential elections to congressional votes. Others point out that without some form of compromise, the convention itself risked collapsing entirely, delaying or even preventing ratification. It remains one of the clearest examples of how the founding documents balance competing interests, sometimes at a significant and lasting moral cost. 93. And speaking of documents that almost didn't survive their own ratification process, the original Constitution presented to the states in 1787 contained no Bill of Rights whatsoever. This omission became one of the most contentious issues during the ratification debates that followed, with several states expressing serious reluctance to approve the document without explicit protections for individual liberties. Anti-federalists argued that without written guarantees, a strong federal government could easily infringe on freedoms like speech, religion, and due process. Federalists initially countered that such protections were unnecessary, since the federal government's powers were already limited to those specifically enumerated in the document itself. This disagreement nearly derailed ratification in key states like Massachusetts and Virginia, where support hinged on promises that amendments would follow soon after. James Madison, who had once downplayed the need for a Bill of Rights, eventually drafted the first 10 amendments himself once elected to Congress. Some historians view this reversal as a pragmatic political necessity, while others see it as evidence that the anti-federalist concerns had genuine merit all along. Either way, the Bill of Rights wasn't part of the original plan. It was added afterward, largely because enough people insisted it had to be. 94. And speaking of collaborative projects hidden behind a single shared identity, the Federalist Papers were written entirely under one pseudonym, Publius, even though three very different men were actually behind the essays. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay collaborated on the series of 85 essays published between 1787 and 1788, aiming to convince New York voters to support ratification of the new Constitution. The shared pseudonym allowed the authors to present a unified argument without readers knowing which specific individual had written which essay. Hamilton wrote the majority of the essays, followed by Madison, with Jay contributing only a handful due to illness during the writing process. Some historians argue the anonymity strengthened the essay's persuasive power, letting the arguments stand on their own merit rather than being tied to any one politician's reputation. Others note that scholars have spent centuries analyzing writing style and word choice just to determine authorship of certain disputed essays. The true authorship behind each individual paper wasn't fully confirmed until many years later, based largely on Hamilton's own list drafted shortly before his death. It remains one of history's more successful examples of coordinated, anonymous political persuasion. 95. And speaking of elections that looked nothing like the contested races we're familiar with today, the very first presidential election in 1789 produced a remarkably unanimous result. The Electoral College, still a new and largely untested system, unanimously selected George Washington as the nation's first president, with every single elector casting a vote in his favor. This unanimous outcome reflected Washington's near-universal respect following his leadership during the Revolutionary War, rather than any particular campaign strategy on his part. John Adams, receiving the second highest number of electoral votes, became the first vice president under the original system, which awarded that position to the runner-up rather than a chosen running mate. This arrangement often placed political rivals in the executive branch together, a structural quirk that would later be addressed through subsequent constitutional amendments. Some historians view Washington's unanimous selection as a rare moment of national unity, coming together around a single trusted figure during a fragile and uncertain period. Others note that the process itself revealed early flaws in the electoral system, flaws that would become increasingly apparent as political parties began to form. Washington reportedly accepted the role reluctantly, viewing it as another form of public service rather than personal ambition. 96. And speaking of early government structures that quickly revealed deep political divisions, Washington's first presidential cabinet brought together some of the era's most brilliant and most fundamentally opposed minds. Alexander Hamilton served as the first Secretary of the Treasury, advocating for a strong central government, a national bank, and policies favoring commerce and industry. Thomas Jefferson, serving as the first Secretary of State, favored a more limited federal government and championed agrarian interests alongside stronger protections for individual states' rights. Their disagreements extended far beyond simple policy differences, touching on fundamentally different visions for what the young nation should ultimately become. These tensions eventually contributed to the formation of America's first political factions, with Hamilton's supporters evolving into the Federalist Party and Jefferson's allies forming the Democratic Republicans. Washington himself remained officially above party politics, though he reportedly grew frustrated by the constant friction between his two most trusted advisors. Some historians argue this rivalry, uncomfortable as it was, ultimately strengthened American governance by encouraging vigorous debate rather than unchecked consensus. Others suggest it planted the seeds of partisan division that would shape, and sometimes complicate, American politics for centuries to come. 97. And speaking of decisions made through political horse trading rather than grand design, the location of the nation's capital itself was the product of a very practical compromise. The Residence Act of 1790 placed the future seat of government along the Potomac River, a decision reached only after Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson struck a deal over dinner. Hamilton wanted the federal government to assume state war debts, a policy Southern states largely opposed since many had already paid off their own. In exchange for Southern support on the debt plan, Hamilton agreed to back a capital location further south, closer to Virginia and Maryland, rather than the northern cities that had hosted Congress before. Some historians view this as a masterclass in pragmatic deal-making, allowing two contentious issues to resolve each other simultaneously. Others note it demonstrates how sectional interests, even in the earliest days of the Republic, shaped decisions that would have permanent, lasting consequences. The land itself was carved from Maryland and Virginia, chosen partly for its central position between northern and southern states. What began as swampy, undeveloped territory would eventually become Washington, D.C., a city whose very existence traces back to a negotiated dinner conversation. 98. And speaking of the labor that physically built the young nation's most iconic buildings, the story behind the White House and Capitol's construction involves enslaved and free laborers whose contributions went largely unrecognized for generations. Records show that enslaved individuals, often hired out by their owners, worked alongside free laborers quarrying stone, cutting timber, and constructing the foundations of these early federal buildings throughout the 1790s and early 1800s. Historians have pieced together payment records and correspondence showing that the government compensated slaveholders directly for this labor, rather than the workers themselves. Some researchers argue this reflects the broader economic reality of the era, where enslaved labor was deeply woven into infrastructure projects across the country, not just in the South. Others emphasize how this history remained largely absent from official narratives for nearly 2 centuries, only gaining wider public acknowledgement through more recent historical research and commemorative efforts. In 2009, a congressional task force formally recognized the role enslaved laborers played in constructing the Capitol, leading to a dedicated marker inside the building itself. It's a quieter, less discussed chapter of the founding era, but one that historians increasingly argue deserves equal recognition alongside the more celebrated stories of architects and statesmen. 99. And speaking of stories that don't wrap up neatly, the founding generation ultimately left behind an experiment that remained, in many important ways, unfinished. The Constitution they drafted addressed structural questions of governance, while leaving fundamental issues like slavery, citizenship, and the balance between federal and state power largely unresolved, to be fought over by future generations. Some historians argue the founders understood these compromises were temporary, expecting future Americans to eventually confront and correct what they couldn't fully settle themselves. Others suggest the founders simply prioritized union and stability over addressing deeper moral and structural contradictions, kicking difficult questions down the road rather than resolving them. Debates over states' rights, individual liberties, and who truly counted as a citizen would continue for centuries, sometimes peacefully through amendments in courts, other times through war and civil unrest. Perhaps that's the most honest way to understand the Founding Fathers, not as infallible visionaries who solved everything perfectly, but as flawed, complicated people navigating an uncertain moment the best they could. Their experiment in self-governance continues today, shaped and reshaped by each generation that inherits it. And on that note, as you drift off tonight, perhaps that unfinished quality is exactly what makes this story worth continuing to tell.